Joseph Burks of Jewin Street, in the City of London, bookseller, maketh oath and faith that he was confined in Newgate near 5 months, subsequent to his being convicted for selling a work entitled The Duties of Citizenship, and prior to judgment being passed on him for having sold the same work. And this deponent further saith that he was sentenced by the Court of King's Bench to 2 years solitary confinement in the House of Correction, Coldbath Fields, from which place he has only been liberated about a month. The above affidavit was made to prove that the discipline of the House of Correction, Coldbath Fields, so far from being the offspring of benevolence, is a system of subtle and refined cruelty. After having been confined in Newgate for 5 months, I was taken from thence on Monday the 21st of November 1796 to the House of Correction. I was conducted through a long dark passage, arched over, with cells on each side. When I arrived at the far end of this passage, the turnkey who attended me opened the door and in a very surly tone said, "Damn you, go in here!" As soon as I had entered, he locked the door upon me. As the cell was completely dark, I felt about me to discover the nature of my abode, which I found to be about 8 feet by 6, very damp. The walls were of brick and covered with moisture, the floor of stone, which in very severe weather is crusted over with ice. On one side of this miserable tenement, I found about 3 feet from the floor 3 planks projecting from the wall, so as to form what is called a bedstead. On this was a straw mat, a small thin rug, and a very filthy blanket. About 7 in the morning, I heard the door unlocked. About 8, a person in a rough, surly voice and venting a horrid oath threw me in a loaf. 3 days a week, my allowance was a pound of bread and water daily. On the other 4 days, 4 or 5 ounces of meat of bad quality and a quart of what is called broth, which nothing but extreme hunger could force a man to swallow. The meat is cut into small pieces, as no knife is allowed. During the 2 years of my confinement, I was not permitted to purchase or receive any provisions from my friends. Nay, more. One time, on my mother's making an attempt to supply me with food, I was struck by the turnkey, confined to my cell, and only released by the governor on promising not to be guilty of a similar offence in the future. I addressed the committee for relief, but was informed it was not a place of indulgence, it was a place of punishment. It would be superfluous to dwell on the sufferings arising from cold, hunger, damp, unwholesome air, from scorn and insult, from the prohibition of pen, ink and paper, knife and fork. In short, from the privation of the necessaries allowed and the mockeries forborne even to the worst felon in the worst jail in the kingdom. Suffice it to say that the oppression became so intolerable that even under the apprehension of brutal violence I complained of my hardships and petitioned for an increase of food and light, and was coolly told by the Reverend Dr. Glass that such allowance was incompatible with the regulations of the house, that it was a place of punishment, not of indulgence, that the discipline was intended to mend the morals and to accustom its inhabitants to temperance. Gracious God! Are these the mild and merciful laws of England? And is this conduct befitting a preacher of that religion which recommends peace and goodwill to mankind? When I returned to my cell after this refusal, all the horrors of the place came upon me with accumulated force, and in the bitterness of my anguish and despair, I prayed for death as a release from my sufferings. The mind of man shudders at the idea of a suicide, of rushing into the presence of his Creator, his hand stained with his own blood. But that man must be a rare instance of fortitude who, a prisoner in Coldbath Fields, possessing the means of self-destruction, should at all times resist the impulse. O fortunate Englishmen who did not live to see the close of the 18th century! This is not the caricature of romance, nor the picture of remote danger. It is a plain statement of evils seen and felt, of evils present, imminent, and staring every Englishman in the face. Where is the Englishman who can secure himself and his children from this public calamity? Perhaps even he who now, either actively or passively, encourages this inhuman scourge, may by a reverse of fortune endure its torments, or if he should escape, Could he rise from the grave a few years hence, might see his family immured in this burial place of the living, this vault of artificial death, almost without food, lodging in a dark and contracted cell, shut out from the light of day. And to finish the catastrophe, exposed to the brutality of that lowest of human beings, a turnkey of the House of Correction in Coldbath Fields. I do solemnly declare that rather than undergo a repetition of my captivity, I would submit to the most cruel death that human malignity could inflict.